Hey, everyone. So my name is Ben. I'm a product manager for messaging at Twilio, and I'm here with my colleagues Elaine and Justin. Elaine is also a product manager at Twilio who works on our messaging experiences team, and Justin over here is in product marketing. And the three of us are going to talk to you today about some of the work that Twilio has done over the past year to help you build and scale your messaging applications, and what you can do to take advantage of these new features. SMS should be easy, right? And sending your first message certainly is easy. 160 characters, it's a well-defined spec, it's 20-year-old technology. Twilio has this beautiful API, it's one call, works beautifully. But sometimes it's not easy. The reality is that SMS globally is actually very complex. Christine Roberts, our GM for our super network, spoke at the keynote this morning about, it's as complex as a jet engine. Right? When you're sending text messages across multiple geographies and you're scaling from 1 to 10 to a million, right? There's gotchas along the way. And Twilio has done a lot of work to automate as much as possible. But there's a lot that you also need to know. Right? So the better you can use the tools, the better you are equipped to be successful. So just to give you some sense of what can go wrong, each country has its own best practices, its own regulations. There are hundreds of carriers, thousands of handsets, and while there's a great spec, they don't all conform to the spec. There's different character encodings that carriers use, delivery reports that you get back from the carriers to know if a message was delivered. They're not always accurate, and they also don't always conform to the spec. So a lot of these things Twilio does automatically for you, but again, not everything we can do on our own. Excuse me. So what I'm going to walk through are 5 steps to master SMS at scale. I'm going to talk through 5 different product features with my colleagues, and we'll tell you how you can take advantage of them. The first one, which is something that Christine alluded to earlier, it's something we just launched, is understanding guidelines for doing messaging globally. Each country handles messaging differently, and there are certain features of SMS that are supported in some countries, and they're not supported in others. Some are required in some countries, and some are optional. And to help you through this, we're very excited to announce today our SMS country guidelines. So this is a new knowledge base that we have on Twilio.com that will show you for countries all around the world the best practices and all the things that you need to keep in mind when you're deploying to these different countries. And I'm going to walk through it in a little more detail. So here's an example of one of the pages for the UK. And the first page is really the country basics. This will show you things like the phone number formatting, prefixes, the local carriers that are supported in the region. And again, we do this for every country in the world. Next up, we talk through the capabilities and the guidelines, so the different features that Twilio supports and that are supported by the carrier and by the country. We also show you some of the best practices, things to avoid, things not to do, and things to do to be compliant within each geography. This is a very important part of the page, and it shows you the different sender IDs which are supported in each country. And depending on where you live, this is either incredibly obvious or incredibly confusing, right? And the reason being is that in each country you have different customs and different regulations about what a sender would look like on your phone, right? When I text my friends, when I text my mom, I use a local number, right? And that's what we're all familiar with on our own handsets. And for some use cases within Twilio, that's a perfectly acceptable way to do messaging. But for other use cases, that's not the best way to do it. In some countries, you would want to get a short code. Right? In the UK, you want a short code. In the US, you want a short code. That's a 5-digit phone number that is used for application-to-person messaging, for running marketing messaging. That's the preferred way to do it by the carriers. And you need to do that for high throughput and to be in compliance. Other countries don't have short codes at all. They have something called alphanumeric sender. And again, depending on where you live, this is either incredibly obvious or you have absolutely no idea. Alphanumeric sender lets the from number that shows up on your handset appear to be a string of letters and numbers, right? So for example, if I was sending a message, it would show up on your handset as coming from Twilio, Twilio. Very different than coming from a local number, which would be like you were texting your friends. And lastly, some countries require that you pre-register that alphanumeric string with the carriers. So you tell them ahead of time, this is the type of messaging that I'm going to do, and here's the message sender that I want to use. And that's a manual process that Twilio can help you with as you're expanding into different geographies. A couple sort of interesting examples of different countries that people don't expect. And Christine alluded to some of these earlier as well. In India, marketing messages can only be sent during a certain period of time during the day, right? So messages that are sent after 9 p.m. local time, they're not going to work if they're marketing messages. In Japan, you want to send messages from local phone numbers. If you're sending messages from foreign phone numbers, they may get filtered by the carriers, right? That's not a good practice, right? So you want to use whatever the local practice is. And I think one of the challenges previously is for developers as they expand around the globe. Previously, you didn't know all of these things, and you had to email Twilio support to learn a lot of these regulations. And you probably didn't even know that there was a better way to do it. So by publishing these guidelines and making them publicly accessible, we're trying to educate everyone that these are the preferred way to do things to make all of you as successful as possible. Step 2. So step 2 to make sure your messages and your applications are performing well is to validate phone numbers. And Twilio has a tool called Lookup, which is another API, which is used to validate phone numbers and to look up the carriers. When you make an API called a Twilio messaging, we do some of this for you ahead of time. So if you try sending to a phone number that's not a legitimate phone number, it's a landline, or maybe it can't be reached with the number you're trying to send from, we'll send you an error. But a much better user experience is to validate the number up front. So you're not failing at message sending time, but you can find out earlier if there's a problem with the number. And where this really comes into play is if you ask your users of your application for their phone number, maybe they type it wrong, right? And you can say up front, hey, this is not a valid number, correct it, and you don't end up storing bad numbers. This is an example of what our lookup API looks like. I apologize, the font is small, but it's basically a request to a Twilio API with the number in question. And what you get back is information about that number, whether it's a mobile number or a landline number. You can find out who the carrier is. And the next question is, why is this important, right? Especially if you just know the number format. Isn't this just a regular expression to match the number? And the answer is that's not exactly true, right? And as you go around the world, the formatting and the requirements change. And it changes if you're dialing a number or if you're texting a number. So here's a great example, which is Mexico. So when you are texting a mobile number, you're going to want to use this 52 prefix. But if you ask a user to just enter their phone number, maybe they won't use that prefix, right? Because it's just not the way you may think about your number, right? You may enter the country code, and it's required to append that prefix before you do it. One good suggestion is to display examples to your users before they enter the number. So you can do it in the text field or right above the text field. Brazil is in the middle of a multi-year renumbering project. So depending on where you live and when it is in time, you're going to have to format numbers differently. So for example, this year, mobile numbers, just in this light blue area, got an additional 9 after the area code. And the real takeaway here is not to rely on homegrown validation. Right? This is a solved problem. Twilio works incredibly hard to keep everything in our lookup API up to date, such that you don't have to continually solve this over and over again. We just give the API to do it out of the box. And lastly, earlier this year, we launched CoPilot. We launched add-ons. So add-ons is part of Twilio Marketplace, which allows third parties to add their applications and their business logic and their data to many Twilio products, particularly add-ons, particularly Lookup, which allows you to use the Lookup API to access more information about that phone number and the person behind that phone number. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Justin, who's going to talk about CoPilot.
Thank you, Ben. Oh, wow, you get an applause. Excellent. Woo! Thank you. I wasn't expecting that. So my name's Justin Peary. I'm the product marketer for SMS. I have a distinctly ruined British accent because any of you who've been to America and tried to order water know that you don't get very far. You get very strange looks. So you have a Bristolian in San Francisco for your SMS product marketing. What I wanted to talk to you today was about my absolute favorite feature of our SMS product. One of the things you've heard today is that sending your first message is easy. But sending your millionth isn't. And what Twilio does really well is help you scale from your first to your millionth and beyond. And then when it gets even harder is scaling amongst countries. In the US, we're fairly fortunate. It's a fairly homogeneous market. We have 50 odd states and mostly it works similarly. But in Europe, especially with the EU, you're sending to different countries, different regulations. So if you want to scale outside the UK, and I know a bunch of folks are here from the Netherlands and from Germany, you need to take into account these things. So one of the great things that Twilio has is called CoPilot. And that enables you to define a number pool and sender IDs so that you can send from what we call a pool of numbers. So who's sent an SMS in the audience? Can I have some hands? Who's sent an SMS? Okay, so maybe 60%. Who's sent one from CoPilot or a messaging service? Okay, so we have a few, and he works for Twilio, so he doesn't count. So the cool thing about messaging services is that when you send us from an SMS, typically you set a from and a to, who you're sending from and who you want to send it to. And that works really well on a one-to-one basis when you're just sending one text message to one person. But for example, in the US, you can only send 250 messages a day per number. And Twilio queues them everywhere in the world because networks will filter your messages. So a bit like email filtering, not every email gets through. If you're not careful and clever the way you send your messages, you'll get filtered. Your users won't get your messages. So for example, in the UK, we queue your messages outbound at 10 messages a second. You could send us 4,000 messages a second, but we'll queue them outwards. So what number pooling does is that you can put a lot of numbers into a pool, 10, 20, 100, 1,000. And that enables you to, if your queuing is 10 messages a second a number, and you want to send 1,000 messages a second, you put 100 numbers in your message pool, and Twilio automatically picks them out for you. And then as you go international, we'll pick the best number to send from. So for example, if you want to send in Germany and you add German numbers to your number pool, you don't have to create new connectors to Twilio to send via a German number. We do that all for you. And then the other thing is that with the normal Twilio API, you'll notice it's a 200 millisecond-ish response time because we do all the validation before we send back the OK. With a messaging service or CoPilot, we do that asynchronously via the status callbacks. So you can actually send us more messages at once. So GeoMatch is the feature that selects the best number or alpha sender ID that's available in your country. So again, if you started in the UK and you want to send to Germany, you just add German numbers and we automatically send from German numbers if they're available. The one gotcha is that we default to US numbers if there's one in if you don't have a local country number, and we default to US numbers if you have one in your number pool. Otherwise, it will be a round robin of other numbers. And then lastly, I mentioned Scalar. Scalar distributes the traffic across your numbers, so to get around queuing and filtering, so you get much better deliverability when you use Scalar. And it's really easy to use. All you need to do is change from a from number to a messaging service SID, and magically you have the power of CoPilot powering your messages. Awesome. Oh, and applause, thank you.
Hey everyone. I'm Lane Tai, and as Ben mentioned earlier, I'm one of the product managers on the messaging experience team. So step 4 of mastering SMS at scale is monitoring your deliverability with message feedback. So what do we mean, right? Well, delivering a message is very complex, and it's not a one-size-fits-all operation. Surprisingly, when you deliver your message, it can take several hundreds of different routes. And your use case and the way that you're delivering your message will differ to the other business and their use case. There are many different factors and many different routes that could be used to deliver a message. And some of these factors include the sender ID you're using, the volume of messages you're sending, the content, the geography, and so forth. And so, one second. We can look at delivery receipts, and delivery receipts will just give us one piece of the pie, but we can't always rely on them. Sometimes they're incorrect, sometimes they're reliable, but they're just the best guess. The most reliable piece of information to know whether your message has been received or not is when your user tells you. Just like when you're texting your mom and she's not responding, you kind of call her and you're like, hey, did you get my message? When you know that someone's received your message, they will tell you. And we trust the feedback that you give us the most. And so when we aggregate all this data, we know what the best route is for your particular account and for your use case. So when you're using, when you have a use case that includes two-factor authentication or URL, and you're requiring the user to take an action, we then know that the user received the message, right? And so we've introduced a feedback API. And with the feedback API, your user is entering the PIN back to your application. You programmatically tell Twilio that the message was received. And then we understand the route that was best for your use case and your particular account. We choose that best route for you, and then we use it to deliver future messages for you. On aggregate, all this data really helps us understand how best to route your message and which route we should use in our super network. To implement this, you include provide feedback in your API request. This tells Twilio that your user is taking an action with your message. By default, this is set as false, and so we're assuming that your message may not have a user action. When you set it as true, you're telling Twilio, hey, I'm going to send you feedback, so we set the message as unconfirmed. Next, you update the message with confirmed. Now we know, okay, that message was definitely delivered. We're basically using conversion as a proxy for deliverability. And so sure, some of your users may not enter their PIN, they might not click on their link, but what we're looking at is consistency. And we're assuming, hey, like we know that you're going to have about a 50%, 70% conversion, and we want to make sure that there isn't any dramatic spikes. And if there is, we want to make sure we're routing your messages differently. But we also want to help you so that you can also monitor your deliverability. And so we're really excited to be launching our message feedback insights. These are rich dashboards that allow you to see your own conversion and deliverability, or deliverability through your conversion. You can drill down to each individual country to see what is happening, how many of your users are confirming. And you can see this over 7 days as well as over 30 days. And so this helps you monitor your deliverability yourself. In essence, by providing feedback, you can get better deliverability. We know which routes are best for your particular account. If you run into issues, if you see anything strange, you can tell our support team. They have this data so they can see, hey, this account looks a little bit strange, and they can work with you and provide better support. And then you can also monitor, and we can work with you to monitor through your dashboards how your deliverability is. So that's step 4. Step 5, investigate issues with message details. How many of you guys have sent a message and then it's delayed? I know I have. And it's really, really, really frustrating. I've worked at Twilio support for 2 years, and to be honest, these are the worst tickets to troubleshoot. You have a customer that says, hey, my message is delayed, and then you're like, yeah, I don't know. And you want to know why, and you want to know what's happening. Just like when you're like texting your friends and the message is delayed, you have no transparency. And it's frustrating and it's hard to troubleshoot. Previously, we would send status callbacks, but the status of the message is just one item, right? Like, what you want to see is how your message is being processed, and how quickly it's being processed, and where latencies may be introduced. As software developers, we want to know like every piece of the pie and how everything is working, so that we can optimize for our use case. So what we've done is we've really revamped our message details page. We've introduced a new delivery steps table. And in the delivery steps table, we tell you how your message is being processed and sent throughout the Twilio platform. This way, you can see your API requests down to the delivery receipt and the time elapsing for each step. Let's take a look through each of the steps. Twilio platform, that's where your API request, you're making the API request, and when Twilio is responding. Next, the outbound queue. This is where Twilio is queuing up all your API requests and then sending them appropriately at the right rate, so that they can be, like certain countries, you want to rate limit them because that will affect your deliverability. In certain countries, they can have a much faster rate limit. So we want to let you know when it's being in-queued and when it's being sent off to the carrier network. Once it's being sent to the carrier network, the last step is the DLR, the delivery receipt. And this shows you when Twilio has received the delivery receipt. So in this example, it's gone through the Twilio platform and then was sent off in 0.8 seconds. And then it took 13 seconds for us to hear back from the carrier network that the message has been delivered to the handset. And so it's really interesting to see which part of the process is fast and which part might have latencies, so that you understand when the message may be arriving at a handset, and when you have messages that are faster or slower. If there's no delivery receipt, we also show you that the delivery receipt was never received, and this times out after 24 hours, because if you're not receiving the delivery receipt after 24 hours, it's more or less like unreliable. For inbound messages, we show you when we've received a message and when we've made a webhook to your application. So there are cases where potentially your application is down or experiencing problems, and you can see here that Twilio tried to make a request and the message wasn't received on the application, but you still have it on the Twilio platform and you can still retrieve that. We hope that this gives you a better understanding of how the message is traversing through Twilio, and that you can see in real time and know what's happening to each of your messages. If you notice anything strange, let our support team know. They have the exact same tools, and they can work with you to analyze your messages so that you can have the optimal experience. So those were the 5 steps to how to master SMS sending at scale. Let's recap them. Step 1, understand SMS guidelines globally. And you can do this by visiting our website. We've recently updated it, and we provide you with as much information as possible about the different sorts of regulations and best practices around the world. Step 2, validate phone numbers with lookups, so that you can provide your customers with the best experience and that they can get their messages delivered right away instead of trying again and again and typing different phone numbers or different ways of typing their phone numbers. Use CoPilot. CoPilot's awesome because you don't have to manage lots of phone numbers. you can manage one pool, and the pool has all the phone numbers that you want to use. Step 4, monitor deliverability with message feedback, especially if your messages have a user action. And then step 5, investigate any issues with the message details page. This is really just the beginning, and we want to surface and provide you with more and more information in the message details page. And we want to aggregate these so that you can get a good understanding of how your application is running. Thank you so much for attending our talk. I know it's lunchtime now, so you guys must be hungry, but we're happy to take any questions over here.